The image of a knight in shining armor, single-handedly holding back enemy hordes, is familiar to everyone. This is Roland, the epitome of honor and courage. His final battle, Europe's greatest epic. But what if this story is a grand deception? What if a heroic legend conceals the truth of a failed military campaign and a humiliating defeat? We embark on a historical investigation spanning over 1,200 years to separate Europe's greatest hero from the man who died in an ambush. It's like comparing a Hollywood blockbuster script to a terse police report. On one side, there's the Song of Roland, an epic about a clash of civilizations. On the other, a single line in the Chronicle of Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, recording the death of several officers in a bandit attack. The canonical version, derived from the poem, paints a magnificent picture. Charlemagne's rearguard, 20,000 Franks, is attacked by a 400,000-strong Saracen army. The cause? The betrayal of Roland's stepfather, Ganelon. Roland, whose pride prevents him from blowing his oliphant horn to summon aid, accepts an uneven battle. His heroic death becomes a symbol of self-sacrifice in the name of faith and king. In the poem, Roland and his loyal friend Olivier, along with the 12 peers of France, the elite of chivalry, hold their ground to the very end. With his sword, Durandal, in whose hilt holy relics were enshrined, Roland slays enemies by the hundreds. This wasn't just a battle. It was a medieval action movie designed to boost morale. Now for the dry facts. Date: August 15th, 778. Location: the Roncevaux Pass in the Pyrenees. The adversary, not Saracens, but local Basque tribes. The reason for the attack, not a religious war, but revenge for Charlemagne's army plundering their capital, Pamplona. This was not a clash of civilizations, but a local guerrilla raid that resulted in the complete annihilation of the Frankish rearguard. The irony is that Pamplona was a Christian city. Charlemagne, the defender of the faith, sacked it because he distrusted the locals and wanted to secure his rear. Thus, the future saintly hero died paying for his king's war crime against fellow Christians. So how did this humiliating defeat, which contemporaries wrote about with great reluctance, transform over 3 centuries into a foundational myth of Western civilization? Who, and more importantly, why, turned an ordinary ambush into an epic battle of good versus evil and a real officer named Hruodland into the immortal Roland? The answer to this question lies in the power of propaganda and the birth of an archetype. This was not merely literary exaggeration, it was a complete inversion of meaning. Defeat became a victory of the spirit. A raiding expedition became a holy war, and a forgotten border commander became the chief superhero of the Middle Ages. This story is less about a battle and more about a brilliant information campaign that spanned 300 years. To understand the origins of this campaign, we must return to the year 778 and look at the map. Charlemagne's empire was at its peak. Then an unexpected offer arrived from the Muslim rulers of Zaragoza and Barcelona. They requested assistance in their struggle against the Emir of Córdoba. This was not a holy war. It was a cynical political deal. Charlemagne saw an opportunity to extend his influence beyond the Pyrenees and agreed. However, the campaign didn't go as planned from the start. Zaragoza, which he had been promised would surrender without a fight, closed its gates. After a fruitless siege, Charlemagne decided to withdraw. To ensure his army didn't leave empty-handed, he plundered and destroyed the Christian city of Pamplona along the way, simply because he distrusted its inhabitants. It was in the rearguard of this retreating army that a man whose name would enter history was found. In the Chronicles, he is called Hruodland, prefect of the Breton March. He was not the king's nephew, nor the greatest paladin. He was a real border governor whose primary duty was to defend the northwestern frontiers against the Celtic tribes of the Bretons. In other words, against other Christians. His career had no connection to fighting Saracens. His presence at the rear of the army indicates high status, but nothing more. He was one of several commanders responsible for covering the retreat and guarding the baggage train. The very baggage train laden with plunder from Pamplona. The setting was the Roncevaux Pass, a narrow, forested mountain defile, an ideal trap. The Frankish army, stretched for miles, was incredibly vulnerable here. Their main asset, heavy knightly cavalry, became a liability on the steep slopes. The Frankish warriors were like tanks stuck in a dense urban environment, powerful but unwieldy and blind. Their adversaries, the Basques, knew every trail. Lightly armed and swift, they had no intention of engaging in a fair fight. Their primary weapon was gravity. They simply rained down stones and boulders on the ironclad Franks. This was not a battle, but a swift and brutal massacre. The Basques specifically attacked the rearguard, where the baggage train was located. Their objectives were revenge for the ravaged Pamplona, and of course, rich plunder. Caught off guard, the Franks were cut off from the main forces and completely annihilated. Charlemagne's biographer Einhard writes that the attackers, having seized their spoils, scattered with the greatest speed under cover of the approaching night. The great emperor could only watch helplessly at the bodies of his men and the plundered baggage train. He couldn't even retaliate. The enemies simply vanished into the mountains they knew so well. For Charlemagne, who had waged wars for decades, the loss of one rearguard was vexing, but not catastrophic. Along with Hruodland, other noble dignitaries perished, such as the Seneschal Eghard and the Count Palatine Anselm. History has preserved little of their names. It was a humiliating, yet in the grand scheme of the empire, routine event that they preferred to quickly forget. And indeed, it was forgotten. After brief, almost procedural entries by Einhard, and in the Royal Frankish Annals, the story of the Roncesvalles ambush vanished from chronicles for almost 300 years. This was a deliberate policy. Carolingian propaganda actively crafted Charlemagne's image as a new David, an invincible defender of Christianity. Accounts of his army being routed and plundered by fellow Christian Highlanders simply did not fit this narrative. Therefore, the shameful incident was buried in the archives, and the official narrative was carefully controlled. But 3 centuries passed, and the world changed beyond recognition. Charlemagne's empire disintegrated. It was replaced by a world of feudal fragmentation and a new knightly class. And crucially, the enemy had changed. In Spain, the Reconquista was gaining momentum, and in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. The Christian world urgently needed heroes and ideological fuel for a holy war. And then, quite opportunely, the Way of St. James gained popularity, a pilgrimage route that led to Santiago de Compostela, precisely through that same Roncesvalles Pass. It was in this atmosphere that the old, forgotten story of the battle in the mountains began its revival. Wandering singers and jongleurs, medieval content creators, picked it up. They intuitively understood what would resonate and what wouldn't. The story of Basque revenge was too localized and inconvenient. But a battle against Saracens? That was a ready-made blockbuster, understandable, relevant, and ideologically sound. Thus, the inconvenient Christian Basques were replaced by easily recognizable Muslim enemies, and a mundane skirmish over plunder was transformed into a great battle for faith. The new feudal society needed a role model. Hruodland, about whom almost nothing was known, proved to be the ideal candidate. Onto this blank slate, all the qualities of a perfect vassal could be projected: absolute loyalty to his lord, boundless courage, and hatred for the infidels. The main transformation occurred. The real Hruodland was a state official, a prefect of the march. The mythical Roland, however, became Charlemagne's nephew and closest comrade. This detail reflects a shift across entire eras. The idea of service to the empire was replaced by the idea of personal loyalty to a feudal lord. Roland became the avatar of a new system of values. Around 1098, at the height of the First Crusade, the oral myth found its canonical written form. The Song of Roland emerged, an anonymous masterpiece that cemented the legend for centuries. The oldest surviving manuscript is preserved in Oxford, and its final line mentions a certain Hruodland. Whether he was the author, a copyist, or a jongleur, we still don't know. But this anonymous genius created something akin to a Bible of chivalry, a clear guide to heroic conduct. The author of the song introduced powerful dramatic drivers into the story that were absent in reality. The figure of the traitor Ganelon, Roland's stepfather, appears. This was a brilliant narrative device. It allowed the devastating defeat to be explained not by Frankish weakness, but by insidious betrayal from within. Alongside Roland emerges the wise Olivier, his loyal friend, who implores him to call for aid. The dispute between Roland's reckless courage and Olivier's sensible caution is the central tension of the poem, transforming it into a true tragedy. It is Roland's pride, his refusal to blow the horn, that leads to the rearguard's demise. The enemy in the poem is a caricatured embodiment of evil. The Saracens worship an absurd trinity, Mahomet, Apollo, and Tervagant. This was pure propaganda, created by analogy with the Christian Trinity to maximally demonize the opponent. The author had not the slightest understanding of Islam as a strict, monotheistic religion. For him and his audience, the Saracens were simply new pagans, idol worshippers, who needed to be destroyed. The battle transforms into an act of sacred history, filled with miracles. Angels descend from heaven to carry Roland's soul to paradise. God stops the sun so that Charlemagne can avenge his paladins, a direct reference to the Old Testament book of Joshua, which places Charlemagne alongside the greatest biblical warriors. At the moment of death, Roland extends his right glove to God, like a vassal pledging fealty to his supreme lord. Thus, an earthly battle becomes a cosmic drama. A pivotal moment in the poem is when Roland finally blows his oliphant horn. He does so with such superhuman force that the blood vessels in his temples burst. The sound, which Charlemagne hears from tens of miles away, is no longer a call for help. There's no one left to save. It's a signal of loyalty, of a sacrifice made. Ganelon tries to convince Charlemagne that Roland is merely playing around on a hunt, but the emperor realizes disaster has struck. The purpose of this dying sound is to ensure historical memory, that the heroic deed would be known, and the heroes would receive a Christian burial rather than perish in obscurity. And the heroic deed was not merely remembered. the Song of Roland became an instant hit, the soundtrack to an entire era. According to chroniclers, William the Conqueror's Norman knights sang it before the Battle of Hastings in 1066 as they charged the Anglo-Saxons. For crusaders embarking for the Holy Land, it was not merely entertainment, but a direct guide to action. Roland's story proved that death in battle against the infidels was a guaranteed ticket to heaven. The poem transformed the primal fear of battle into religious ecstasy and a thirst for valor. Thus, Roland became the benchmark, the prototype of the ideal knight. His image helped to crystallize the very code of chivalry: absolute loyalty to one's lord, boundless courage, contempt for death, and defense of the faith. The poem became a textbook for generations of European aristocracy, shaping the ethics of an entire social class. This is a unique instance where a fictional character exerted more influence on the behavior of real warriors than any military regulation. If you wanted to be a knight in the 12th century, you had to be like Roland. The legend quickly spread beyond France, becoming a pan-European heritage. In Italy, the austere epic transformed into a grand fantasy. In poems like Orlando Innamorato, and especially Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, a Renaissance bestseller, chivalric valor was augmented by magic and complex love intrigues. In it, Roland evolves from a warrior of faith into a knight who goes mad with unrequited love for a pagan princess and furiously destroys a forest naked. The myth proved so flexible that it could evolve from military propaganda into an adventure novel. Soon, Roland's name, his sword, Durendal, and his horn Oliphant became true medieval brands. Across Europe, places associated with the legend became tourist attractions for pilgrims. In the market squares of German cities, statues of Roland began to appear as symbols of urban liberties and independence from episcopal authority. The famous statue in Bremen, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, still serves this purpose today, and his sword, Durendal, even became a relic. An old blade still protrudes from the rock above the French sanctuary of Rocamadour, which for centuries was believed to be Roland's very sword. Fiction had firmly embedded itself in the stone and steel of European civilization. The journey from Hruodland to Roland is a universal recipe for myth-making, effective from antiquity to the present day. First, a real but minor event is taken, in this case the ambush of 778. It is suppressed until society demands a heroic story. Then oral tradition, like a living organism, adapts the narrative to the needs of a new era, altering enemies, motives, and scale. Finally, a brilliant work of art, the Song of Roland, crystallizes the myth in its most powerful and perfect form, rendering it immortal. The historical core is merely a grain of sand around which the pearl of legend grew over 300 years. The poem itself did not create this pearl, but merely polished it to an ideal luster. But why was this story so necessary? Because for 11th and 12th century Europe, such a myth was vitally important. It ideologically justified the Crusades, provided a role model for the new knightly class, and created a shared heroic past for fragmented feudal states. Roland became popular not despite historical truth, but precisely because it was entirely disregarded. He offered a unified Christian Europe, or Christendom, a common enemy, a shared value system, and a common hero. In this sense, the fictional Roland did more for the formation of European identity than many real kings and emperors. And this legacy lives on to this day. The real Hruodland, prefect of the Breton March, was erased from history. but his fictional counterpart Roland continues to live in books, films, and games. This story demonstrates that for culture, fiction often proves more significant than truth. We need not so much real heroes as symbols that embody our ideals. Every time a paladin class character appears in a modern fantasy universe, a holy warrior, loyal to their god and code of honor, it is a distant echo of the Song of Roland. And the greatest paradox is that the only reason we even remember the name of the real Hruodland is the grand fiction that was built upon his bones.